So in this video, I'm going to provide a demonstration of how I use the Bruno REST API client for exploratory testing. You can find the Bruno client at usebruno.com. And one of the benefits for Bruno is that it is free. There are paid plans which give you the ability to run scripts or run collections with lots of data, and there's a whole bunch of other features. I tend not to use those because I don't tend to automate from within a REST client. I tend to automate using an HTTP library, but I do use REST clients for exploratory testing. And Bruno is simple, it's easy to use, it's very fast to start. It reminds me of what Postman and Insomnia used to be like. They used to be clients which were dedicated to creating collections of requests, adding new requests, executing the requests, seeing the results, and exploring and changing the data, issuing more requests. Postman and Insomnia are now massive API ecosystem tooling suites. So when I do exploratory testing, I want something simpler like Bruno, and that's currently my default. So when we open the Bruno client, we can see all the collections over here on the left. And if you expand this, you'll see all the requests that you've got in the same way that you do with Postman and Insomnia. So I'm going to create a collection. I have to choose a location on the disk for this. So let me do Bruno demo. So I'm just going to save it on disk. When you save the collections from Bruno, each request is an individual file in the folder which represents the collection. That makes it very easy to put under version control, makes it very easy to work with and back up and share it with other people. So my new Bruno demo collection should be right at the bottom here. I am going to choose developer mode just in case I ever want to do any scripting, because then the script has more permissions and I can access the file system, which is very useful if you want to add logging or anything else into your process. So now we can see the collection overview with all the settings. We'll come back to this later because really the first thing I want to do is add a request in here. I'm going to use the simple API from API challenges to demonstrate this. So let me get the API docs for this up. So the URL here is, and it's not docs, I'm going to make one of the GET requests and I will use the items. So I'm just going to call this GET items. Oh, look at that. And you can create from curl. That's the first time I've noticed that. That's excellent. This is a very handy thing when you've got a curl command, maybe someone's raised a defect, you can paste it in here and create a request from that. Not doing that yet. Shouldn't have got distracted at this point in time, but that's an exciting feature to see. Okay, so now I will create this request, and if we issue this request, we see it's gone off to the server and shown as the response. So we've got the basic ability to create requests and issue them and see the responses and the headers, and this is all the instances of this request that we've made. We could write automated execution in here to check the results. I tend not to do this. In fact, I don't tend not to do this. I've never done this. When I'm doing exploratory testing, I do use scripts to generate data, but I do not really use scripts to assert on the results. So I've never used the assert feature, test feature. I've never used docs. Everything I've done has been up with the params body headers off var script sections. So we've made a request here. I'm going to make other requests and build them in. So what I'm really going to do here is I'm going to use a variable. Let's do Control X to get rid of that. And I'm going to create a variable called base URL. And I'm going to add that as an environment variable. So I'll configure, create environment, call it API challenges, add variable base URL. That's right. Now the reason I do that is sometimes I will run the API locally. So it's very useful to have a collection of requests where the host URL is configured in an environment variable. So I tend to use environment variables in the actual environment up here. I don't tend to use collection level variables, but that can be quite useful. So now that I've got a base URL in here, I'm going to quickly get the collection settings up, and in the presets, put in as my preset base URL, base URL. Now, the reason I'm doing that is we've created this as a variable, and I don't really want to enter it every time I create a new request. So let me add a new request in here. We can see that it's put in the preset base URL, so I don't have to add that. Let's find another get in here. So here's a get, the simple API random ISBN, paste that in, and this will be get ISBN, create. Now if I issue that request, there we go, it's made a call to the API challenges eviltester.com/simple API/random ISBN. So now I've got what I needed, which is the two initial requests. So let's explore the UI and see what features we've got. So we can edit parameters in here. So rather than have to remember the syntax, Q equals B and P equals R, I could do all the editing down here, T and Z, and you can see it's put the parameters in the URL there to make those requests. The reason this is quite useful is not so much for the editing, it's for toggling them on and off at different times. That gives us the ability to make lots of requests from the same base template, which is really useful when you're doing exploratory testing and you want to try the different combinations of parameters in a request. So let me just delete all those. Let me quickly turn this into a post. And one of the things here is you cannot add custom verbs in here. If you want to send a request with a custom verb, you'll have to use the HTTP method override header so that the server treats it as a different verb. But this is the set of HTTP verbs that you're going to use most of the time for exploratory testing. So this is fine. This has not impacted me in any way. So now that I've got a post, I could try and add a body. Now with the body here, you can choose the style, and what it will do is it will then automatically send through the right header. So if I post to simple API items now, we'll get told that the field is mandatory for the values I didn't put in because I didn't put in a payload. And if I look in the timeline here, I can see what request was sent out, and I can see that it's put in the content type header, application JSON. If I change this to XML, send that, we can see it's issued a request with application XML. So by changing the content type, it's going to change the format of the message. Now I don't have to keep like that. I can go in the headers here and do content type. Now you see I don't have any code completion on the key, but as soon as I come in and it recognizes the key, I can say content type application, and then we've got a drop down list we can choose from. So although I'm editing the body as XML, I'm going to send through a content type of JSON, and there we go. So I can edit it as XML and get all the advantages for the syntax highlighting, but I'm overriding the header that's put here. This is an important set of features when you're doing exploratory testing because you want to mix and match and be able to send invalid requests. So let me get rid of that override header, put the JSON in here, and let's see if we can create an example. So here's an example input. Let me put that in here and send that through. So now I've created something on the server by issuing a post request. You can see that I had to switch into the body to enable the syntax highlighting, but once it's enabled, I've then got the advantage of syntax checking. I can see there's an error here, but this error will not stop me sending the request, which means I can send invalid requests to the server, which is important for my exploratory testing. Okay, so let's put that back. And if I'm going to issue another post request, I need to make sure I change the ISBN number because that has to be unique. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send in a JSON request, but I'm going to ask for application XML. So I'm adding a custom header into my post request, and I can see that the response I get is in XML because the API is honoring the accept header. So going from left to right, we could easily add authentication to the request. I could put basic auth in here and get a nice form and it will create the header for me. Let's just double check. The API doesn't need authentication, but there's no harm in sending it through. And when I send through this request, making sure that I change that. So if I look at the timeline, we can see that it added the basic authentication header in here. I didn't have to do anything special. So it makes it easy to add authentication, bearer tokens, whatever else you need. And if you want to, you can just go straight in and add it as a custom header anyway. We can set up variables at the request level or the collection level. I tend to use them at the environment level, and sometimes I'll configure them using scripts. Now, scripts can be used for automating, checking the results, various other things. I tend to use it for helping me. So one thing that I do frequently is I'll do console.log, and I want to output what the request I'm issuing, because you can see here that I can see the timeline of this request, but not all the requests that I've made. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to output some of the information from the request object that Bruno has created every time it makes a request, because the scripting gives you access to the request and the response and various sets of environment variables. And you can see we've got code completion in here. So I'm going to say I want to output the method from the request, and I want to output the URL. Let's do that. Request.get URL. Now this is a console log. So to see the console log, I have to open the developer tools. So view developer tools. There we go. Let me quickly clear that. And now when I run the request, let me just switch this over to a get. We can see that it's outputting the request for me. Now, this is scripted at a request level, so only that request has this. So if instead I go up to the collection settings and put this in the script here, now any request in this collection will output the basic information about what request is being made. So I can do get an ISBN, can come back, I can do get items. So now I'm just creating a little log of the request that I'm issuing. That can be useful for me during exploratory testing. And sometimes I will output more information to the console depending on what I'm doing. So I find this quite useful for just random scripting. One of the other things that we can do with the scripts is I can create data. So what I'm going to do in the collection is I'm going to make available to me a variable at any point in time. So I want some random data available to me. Because one of the issues with the simple API is you have to keep remembering to put in a unique ISBN number. So what I'm going to do is I'm always going to randomly generate a unique ISBN number called ISBN 13. And so when I go into my post items, rather than using the ISBN 13 here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the variable ISBN 13. Let's make it quoted. So now if I issue this request, I can see that I've issued a post on the simple items because that's in my log, but I've also randomly generated an ISBN here. If I do that again, it's generated another random ISBN. So this is quite useful in helping me do my exploratory testing. If I don't really care what value I'm putting in here, I just care that it's valid, then I can randomly generate it using the script. And because this is at the collection level, any request that I want to make has access to this variable and I can put it into the request. Other things with the scripting, you can see all the documentation for scripting on the site. And we've got lots of examples for using Bruno here. And here's all the information that you need about the scripts. Now, when I was looking through the script information here, I saw that there were some libraries already available. So I can see that I can use the Lodash library. So I'm going to use Lodash to generate some data for the type. I could do this in straightforward JavaScript, but it's worth demonstrating that if I want to use some of these inbuilt libraries, I have to require them so that they're there in my code. So this is now going to set a variable called type, which is going to be available to my requests. So in the post here, I can just put type. And if we've done all this correctly, Now it should be randomly generating a type. So we just create a book with a random ISBN. Now we've created a CD with a random ISBN. And again, this would help me if I was focused on trying to explore the price or explore the numbers in stock. I can focus on that part of the data rather than having to constantly update the ISBN to make sure it's unique. I can just randomly generate it and randomly generate the type. Depending on what type of testing I'm doing, this can be quite useful with the scripting capabilities. And I tend to put the scripts in the collection. Now, one thing we should mention is that all the files for Bruno are stored in a folder. So for this particular collection, all the files for this collection are in this Bruno demo folder. And that makes it a little bit easier to manage for version control because we're working at an individual file level. Each request is its own file. All the config is in here, which makes it easy to edit. It's easy to add to version control and share with people. That's one of the benefits for Bruno. Because it's file system based, you can put it into Git, you can share it easily. I think you have to log in to Postman and Insomnia to have shared collections. With Bruno, because it's in the file system, it's very easy to handle that. So what else do I do when I'm doing exploratory testing? Well, one of the things that we have to remember to do when we're working with Bruno is to save the request. You can see here that this has been amended, and the little disk icon here means I should save it. But next to the little disk icon is the generate code. This is quite useful because I can then generate curl requests from it. We saw earlier on that you could import curl. So in fact, let's test that. Curl is very useful because it's a command line tool for making HTTP requests. If you create in your REST client an HTTP call that triggers an error, you probably don't want to share your entire collection, but you might want to keep a record of what request you made. The easiest way to keep a record of it is to convert it into curl, because then you can issue that request from a command line. Anyone can repeat the request that you just made. You can put this into a defect report. So I'm just going to copy that. I could run this directly from the command line if I had curl running, but what I'm quickly going to test is creating a new request from curl. So we'll call this imported, enter curl request, and we'll make sure that it can convert its own requests. So there we go, imported. Let's prettify it. And that all looks pretty much what we sent through. Now, one of the issues, I guess, with the export there was it was converting into code, not the request that was made, but the variable. So if you're using variables, you might have to be a little bit careful and make sure that when you convert it, you copy in the actual value that you passed in. We have to be aware of what we're doing, but we can import requests from curl, which can be useful if you're investigating a defect that someone else has raised. They've put it in as curl. You want to issue the same request. You can just create a new request and import it from curl, and you're good to go. Okay, so finally, getting to the end here, a few of the, I don't know if we class them advanced features. When I am testing, very often we're working with OpenAPI specification files. So I want to be able to import those into Bruno. So if I go into import collection, then I look at my application, I can see that it has an OpenAPI file. So I could download these files and open the API file locally. Or because this is available from a link, let me copy the link address, I should be able to open it as a URL in here. Let's import it. And I want to save it to disk. And I'll save it in my YouTube Bruno overview folder and import it. So right down the bottom of the collections now, it's created the simple API mode. Let's use developer mode, and we can see this is the one that we just created. So because it's imported it from OpenAPI, I've now got all the requests that are listed in that OpenAPI file. One of the things that's useful with Bruno is if your OpenAPI file has the environments listed, and this one does, I can choose to have the return all instances of items using the simple API items. And you can see we've got the base URL environment variable in here automatically. and it's red, which means it doesn't have a value set. But if I go up to the environment, I can choose the cloud-hosted version, and it will automatically be set to API challenges EvilTester.com, so I can very quickly get started with the API testing using an open API file. And the other thing that is essential for me when I'm testing is to make sure that I'm not restricted to just the client. I'm using the client to help me test, but there are going to be things I want to do, and I want to be able to see what requests this client is actually doing, not just in the timeline view. I'm going to use Burp Suite for that. I'll use the temporary project defaults. So as soon as I come into Burp Suite, I need to see which port it is hooked onto. So if I look in the proxy and the settings, I can see it's on localhost 8080. So I then need to configure Bruno. To do this, I could either do this at a collection level in the proxy, but I'm going to use the global configuration up here in preferences. This means that any of the API calls I make from any of the collections would go through the proxy. And I've clearly done this before, so it's set to the host and port. So let me save that and go back to my request, issuing this request. Okay, we got a 200 OK get, which means that the request has been sent through and it should be listed in my proxy here. There it is. So now I can see very easily what the full scope of the request is. And if I ever needed to do a custom verb, I can send that to repeater and then issue a trace. Let's say trace on this, send that. And we can see that now we've got a 501 not implemented. This is something that I can't do within Bruno. I can't issue a trace request because it's not listed here in the verbs, but I can feed it through a proxy and allow me to do the testing there. So Bruno works really well in combination with the proxy to let me do anything else that I want to be able to do. So that's a quick demo of Bruno. It's fast to start, it's lightweight, it's focused on sending requests and owning them in collections. And it's got a very simple approach to scripting, which I find quite useful because I don't use these tools for automated execution. I use them to support my testing. You can find Bruno at usebruno.com. You can download it here. One thing that's worth noticing is that the documentation is pretty good, and because it's open source, it's maintained on GitHub, so you can see any issues and problems or questions that people have, and the discussion forums are also quite useful. I find the discussion forum useful. There's one in here called Scriptmania. Yes, there is Scriptmania. And there are lots of sample scripts in here. So if you're experimenting with the scripting capabilities in Bruno, there's lots of examples that you can base or just copy and paste in here. I found this quite useful when I was trying to learn how to script Bruno. And once you download Bruno from usebruno.com, remember to go over to apichallenges.eviltester.com, where we have lots of information about how to test APIs, what APIs you can test. We've got lots of listed practice sites and exercises that you can do with those practice sites. So pick your tool, evaluate Bruno, practice your API testing, and I'll see you in a future video.